So everyone, I would like to officially introduce Deputy Prime Minister Qubad Talabani. He's a Deputy Prime Minister of the Kurdistan region, and he's a long-time practitioner of international affairs. Particularly, he has followed intimately on the U.S. relations with the Kurds as well as Iraq in general. And as you have noticed throughout the course, the U.S. has played a very positive as well as a negative role in many of the issues in the region, and I think the Kurds have been the recipients of both positive and negative actions based on successive policies adopted by different presidents. We've read an article, Qubad, on the Kurds and the United States, which gives us an overall wrap-up of the relationship since the beginning of the quote-unquote Kurdistan, the Kurdish problem or the Kurdish question. With this, I would like to leave the floor to you to give us your impressions about this relationship, and then we can open the floor for different Q&A. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Professor. Thank you guys for participating and for welcoming me. It's a pleasure to be speaking to you. U.S.-Kurdish relations. This is a complicated relationship, almost described as a one-sided love affair, and one that we've constantly tried to manage over the last, I would say, it's been a long relationship, but I would say it's gone through various iterations in the last 30 years, really since the first Gulf War. The current state of play in Kurdistan vis-a-vis the US is one of concern. We have just gone through the 4 years of the Trump administration where there wasn't a very coherent Iraq policy coming out of Washington. We're now entering, fully entering into the Biden administration policy for Iraq, which again is not very, there isn't a clear policy. Now, if there isn't a clear policy vis-a-vis Iraq, then there's certainly not going to be a clear policy vis-a-vis Kurdistan, because historically the Kurdish piece of the US policy has always been part of a broader policy on Iraq. Now, if you go back to 2003, from 2003 until 2011, there was a heavy level of engagement by the US on Iraq, on Kurdistan, independently of each other and collectively, because the US was heavily engaged during those years. But after 2011, I would say that the relationship, I think, changed. The US engagement in Iraq began to normalize. The troop withdrawal happened, and the kind of status of forces agreement came into effect between the US and Iraq, and this overly militarized relationship between Iraq and the US started to take on a much more civilian look. Now, over the years, that has become even more civilianized, if that's even a word, and it's now at a point where Iraq has just gone through another election. One of the big ticket policy items facing the Iraqi government is going to be how it handles the US presence in Iraq, and in particular the coalition presence in Iraq. There are many Iraqi political parties that are calling for a complete withdrawal. This is what they publicly claim. Many of them privately may say something else. The Kurds, we've always been very consistent on this particular issue, and we feel that there requires to date a US engagement with Iraq, and that includes both civilian, economic engagement, but also we believe that the war against ISIS isn't complete, and the Iraqi security forces and the Kurdish security forces are not necessarily capable to stand on their own feet at this moment and fight this fight in a way that would assure us a degree of victory. So there is still a request and a belief that there is a role for the US military to play in Iraq now and going forward. So this is going to be a contentious issue over the next 6-7 months. It's going to be, I think, a key issue that will be discussed as the next Iraqi government is being formed. So the Kurds, we've been unequivocal on this. We've always been very, very honest, very kind of upfront on this particular issue. Parallel to the kind of the US presence side of things, we're constantly trying to kind of engage the US, the UK, the European countries, and other interested countries as well, not just to look at Iraq through this security prism, but also look at Iraq and specifically Kurdistan as a potential economic partner, as a political partner in the region. So the notion of, you know, everything being tied to whether there's US military in Iraq or not, we want to broaden that discussion and broaden that dynamic, because really Iraq needs more than the US's military. It needs its financial assistance, it needs its reform assistance. It's going to require strong cooperation with the Treasury in the United States, because Iraq still operates using dollars. So this zero-sum game of looking at this relationship purely from a military perspective is it's very unwise for the Iraqi politicians just to look at this that way. There's more to this relationship than just the military component of it, and I think we're maybe less, we're under much less public pressure to have this public stance against the US, because in general the Kurdish population likes the US, despite that storied history and that complicated history between the US and Kurdistan. So again, we still are trying to, you know, sometimes in vain, trying to attract the attention of Washington. And as Washington distances itself from Iraq, we feel we get very nervous, because as it distances itself from Iraq, then obviously means a distancing from Kurdistan, which then would leave Iraq, I think, in a much more precarious situation regionally. And, you know, again, it's one thing you can predict in Iraq, that it's going to be unpredictable. So I think that's where we are at the moment, and I'd be happy to kind of delve into more detail with you all as you ask your questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Qubad. Before I leave the floor to the guys to ask you questions, could you actually reflect on the historic relationship between the Kurds, particularly? I know that your late father, the great Qubad Talabani, worked hard to actually place the Kurds in a place where they wouldn't be part of the polarization taking place, particularly during the Cold War. And the Kurds were among the first people to pay for the polarization, particularly having been in a very strategic location. You have the region around you was very volatile and still is. Could you reflect on the historical relationship of the Kurds, be it the Barazanis or the Talibanis, with the United States?
Sure. I mean, historically, the relationship was always a covert one, and there's a very famous Henry Kissinger quote that when they let the Kurds down in the 70s, and Iraq and Iran reached an agreement under the Algiers Accord, and part of that agreement was to stop all support to the Kurds, which basically led to the collapse of the Kurdish revolution and mass migration from Kurdistan to Iran and to various countries. This was the real big betrayal that we still talk of to this day. And when the US Congress posed this question to Henry Kissinger, saying you guys abandoned the Kurds, there was a famous response by saying that the covert work is not missionary work. So until 91, the relationship really was much more of a covert relationship, you know, looking at us as some sort of tool in a larger game, be it between Iraq and Iran at the time, or be it between East and West. So we never really developed into a entity that had a more kind of overt relationship or an influential relationship. I think that all changed after 91, when there was obviously there was the Gulf War, and then there was the fallout of the Gulf War. Then US President George H.W. Bush said, look, if the Iraqis are unhappy with their government, then they should take matters into their own hands. Well, we took that as a green light to have a revolution. So we had a revolution, but then the US they gave Iraq the authority to crush that revolution. Iraq used its military helicopters and put down that revolution. We didn't quite, understand what then President Bush Senior was. What did he refer to when he asked Iraqis to take the matters into their own hands? We're Kurds. We're kind of very direct when we thought that was a green light to launch a revolution. Guess not. But that crushing of the Kurdish uprising led to a mass exodus again. The images of Kurds displaced on the borders of Turkey and Iran. It was at the time when CNN was becoming this global TV station, and the CNN effect was actually coined as a result of the impact of the images of all of these Kurds on the borders of Turkey and Iran, and the humanitarian crisis that ensued. Forced the world to act. The US, the UK, and France launched UN Resolution 688, which then led to the no-fly zones being established, the safe haven being established over the 36th parallel in Kurdistan, northern part of Kurdistan. And that kind of led to this experiment of Kurdish self-rule. In 92, we had our first elections. We had our first Kurdistan regional government, the Kurdistan parliament. This wasn't necessarily let's say, this wasn't really wanted by the US at the time. It was like an unintended consequence of the no-fly zones. And after a brief period of internal civil war between 94 and 97, after 97, Kurdistan started to really thrive. It started to develop, civil society started to emerge. We started to come across as this kind of interesting area, part of Iraq, but not very pro-Western looking, and we started to get the attention of the world in a way that we had never done so before. That led to this kind of ramping up of interest in the Iraqi opposition. Circa 2000, 2001, 9/11 happens. Bang, the whole thing changes. The world is interested in Iraq. The US suddenly is pursuing a regime change policy in Iraq. And, well, who are the Iraqis that the US can work with?
I think Qubad is breaking up. Qubad, are you still with us?
Hi, I'm
Are,
back, I think.
yeah.
Did you lose me?
For like a minute or less, maybe.
Okay, so basically, fast forward, post 9/11, we become the tip of the spear in Operation Iraqi Freedom. There's regime change, the regime is changed. We're in Baghdad all of a sudden, we're kingmakers in Baghdad. And in 2005, between 2005 and 2012, Kurdistan just blossomed politically, economically, infrastructure-wise. And it was such a stark contrast to the rest of the country that we became known as the other Iraq. So suddenly, from being this experiment in 91, 92, we've become like the golden children of Iraq. We became that part of Iraq that everyone wished the rest of the country looked like. Now we had our flaws and we still have our flaws, but at the time when the rest of the country was mired in conflict and violence and incompetence and a whole host of problems, there was this oasis. We became more than a footnote, we became more than a useful. We were more than just an intelligence asset. We suddenly became a political powerhouse, an economic hub too. Now, that kind of, again, while there was this full-on US engagement with Iraq, this was great for us. But as that engagement with Iraq has kind of taken a different iteration. Obviously, that has kind of impacted the depth of the relationship, the engagement with Kurdistan. That said, the largest consulate in the world is being built in Erbil, and the entities within the U.S. government, the various branches of government that are engaging with us are growing. They're not shrinking. So I think that we are in a position to be of strategic importance to the US, but there's also some responsibilities on us to make ourselves to be continue to be relevant to big powers like the US. So it's a period of transition right now.
Before I leave the floor to the questions, could you tell us the anecdote about your father and when he said to the Europeans or the Americans, they called them friends, the friends and the brothers thing, to try to get us, draw us a picture of the region?
So my father, he was at the State Department meeting with the then Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Policy, a gentleman by the name of David Welch, a seasoned kind of Arabist within the US State Department system. And my father was saying, so we're dealing with our Iranian brothers, and maybe get our British friends to help us with our Iranian brothers, and then you as our American friends need to help us more with our Turkish brothers. And Mr. Welch got offended. He's like, Jalal, what is this? The Turks and the Iranians are your brothers and we're just your friends? Explain this. And he said, David, a brother is imposed on you. A friend is somebody you choose. And the Iranians and the Turks and our neighbors, we didn't necessarily choose them. They were kind of imposed on us, and we were probably imposed on them. But friends, you get to choose, and you get to call them friends. So that it kind of gives you so we constantly refer to our neighbors as our beloved brothers.
Thank you. Okay, guys, who would like to start? Who's starting? Come on, guys.
Yeah, I have a question.
Go ahead.
So first of all, yes.
Identify yourself.
My name is Josep Turujan, and Mr. Talabani, thank you for the introduction. I have a question relating to your hopes in being relevant to the US government as a strategic position in the East. But my question is, with the history of the Kurds being let down, is there a sort of reluctance or something you have learned from history to kind of better establish contact with the US?
Yes, I think the most bitter lesson from history is that there are no friendships in diplomacy. There are only interests. So long as we can secure interests, now those interests some days might be political, some days may be security, some days may be economic, some days it should be a combination of the three. Then we feel that we will remain relevant. But if we just put it down to, oh, we're friends and we like each other and they like us and we like them, well, guess what? Sometimes you make another friend and you lose an old friend and you make a new friend. So it can't just be an emotional relationship based on friendship. We have a long history. We have many friends of the US in Kurdistan. I consider myself one of them. But again, this isn't something that can rely on friendship alone. It has to be deeper than that, and it has to involve, I think, mutual interests. The world is big, and there's a lot of countries vying for US attention and support. So again, we have to be relevant, and the only way to do that is to be strategic.
Great, thank you. Who wants to go next, please? Yes, go ahead.
Yes, my name is Daron Susani. Thank you again for the speech, Mr. Talabani. I have a small question. I believe you mentioned that 9/11 was very significant for the development of the Kurds inside Iraq, right?
9/11 was relevant to become on the map and the radar of the US in a way that perhaps we hadn't been before, because it really triggered a much more intense look into regime change. Obviously the war in Afghanistan had happened, the response to Afghanistan had happened, but the drumbeat for the Iraq war really took on a different turn after 9/11. And obviously when you look at the whole host of Iraqi opposition figures, many exiled in London, good people, I'm not knocking them, but they were exiled. We were one of the few entities who were not an exile entity. We were on the ground and we had assets. So that was the impact of 9/11 for Kurdistan. It was more about Kurdistan's stature within the US kind of policy circles.
And do you think that it's because they overthrew Saddam Hussein, that's why the Kurds had they had kind of like an opportunity to go into this phase, or is it like there's another thing that caused it?
So no, I think there's two windows really in the lead up to the war in 2003, and then a period after the overthrow of Saddam. And I think the Kurds, throughout our history, we have always been our worst enemy. And just when we've needed to make the right decision throughout history, we've usually made the wrong decision. I don't know if that sounds familiar to
Yeah,
any countries. But that has always been a very Kurdish way to, just when the world wants you to do the right thing, you do the wrong thing. The two times we did the right thing were in the build-up to the Iraq War and in the post-Iraq War period. These are two times where I think we got it 100% spot on. We were strategic in unifying before the war to provide again an asset and a resource to the US-led coalition that was gold for them, just from an intelligence perspective, from a geographic perspective, from a geostrategic perspective, and from just a pure capabilities perspective. That was one. The second period in the post-Saddam era, we were very strategic because we were organized, we were unified. The Kurdish parties came together. We went to Baghdad together. We fought for Kurdish rights and cemented Kurdish rights within the Iraqi constitution because we were united and because we had a very clear vision. We had sound leadership. And that leadership really created an environment that allowed for Kurdistan to thrive because, God, fear that the enemy that is going to one day come back and hurt you and had gone. And with that, business boomed, investors came, Kurdistan started to thrive, and that, I think, again, that is of us doing the right thing, making the right decision at a very strategic and difficult time. Had we not been united, we wouldn't have been a reliable partner, and we wouldn't have gotten nearly the outcomes we did get. Constitutional debate, that critical period from 2005 to 2007, 8, 9, 10.
I think I have someone who wants to ask a question over the group. Anyone wants to go ahead first?
Me, Professor. I want to ask about, can you tell the Trump administration withdrawal of troops? Can you tell us how it, in the fight against ISIS, the latest one, can you tell us its implications on the Kurds, how it happened, and what was the negotiations that led to the withdrawal?
Can you explain a bit more? What do you mean by the withdrawal?
Lately in the Trump administration before Biden, we've read about the U.S. stopping the fight against ISIS, where they supported Kurds in the fight.
Right. I think that was in Syria. Are you referring to what happened in
In
Syria?
Syria, yes.
Yes, yeah. Yes, so there was a statement, there was a tweet, in fact. You know, there was a tweet, and the tweet created an uproar, and it didn't really result in anything tangible on the ground. It just made a lot of noise and made a lot of people concerned and brought a lot of international attention to the situation. It complicated the dynamic with Turkey a little bit. But at the same time, the US is still in Syria, and there's still some support to the Kurds in Syria, and there's still strikes against ISIS targets in Syria and in Iraq with the Kurds and without the Kurds. So there was, like most things that happened during those 4 years, there was a lot of noise, but you trying to kind of cut through all of the political noise, it didn't really change much on the ground. Now, you know, again, the US presence in Syria was never that big, and the way that the conflicts are evolving today, you don't need these large kind of military deployments anymore. With the use of technology and drone strikes and rapid reaction forces and counterterrorism forces, you know, countries like the US can be much more economic with their assets and resources, but be as effective, maybe even more effective as they had been in the past.
Okay, Mr. Talabani, I have a question from Edward. He cannot use his microphone for some reason, so I will ask it on his behalf. Edward is saying, throughout history, the US has always used the Kurds for their own interest and has abandoned them in vital moments, in a way betrayed the Kurds. Why did this happen frequently, and how can the Kurds prevent it from happening again in the future? So how do you make the region, and not only Kurdistan, relevant to different doctrines? We've studied different presidential doctrines going all the way back to the Truman Doctrine. How do we transcend these foreign policy doctrines to make the US, and this is my question also here, how can we get soft power from the Americans which are sustainable and long-lasting, as opposed to the shock and awe doctrine, which goes away when the troops start falling?
Yeah, so I think this is what, you know, I spent 12 years in the US trying to cultivate the relationship between Kurdistan and the US, and you know, studying history, we realized that again, this can't just be a covert relationship, and this can't just be a very
Qubad, you're breaking up. Maybe you should turn off your camera, maybe?
As a whole, for a start. That means all of the entities that make up the National Security Council. You've got state, the NSC itself, the President's Office, the Vice President's Office, the Defense Department. This is all within the executive branch. Now, understanding that the US is not a kind of monolithic entity, the US Congress is extremely influential in setting policy and in monitoring policy. So getting both friends and supporters in the Senate and in the House of Representatives became a real priority for us in those years that I was in the US. We launched the first Kurdish American Congressional Caucus, for example, to try to build a lobby of support for the Kurdish cause within the House of Representatives, within the Senate. So you've got, this is not to use the Congress against the administration, but it's about not putting all of your eggs in one basket. Now, that's not enough, because where do congressmen and women and senators get their information from? Sure, there's offices, diplomatic missions like mine at the time, or we'd constantly visit and educate, but people get their analysis from academic institutions, from universities, from professors, from think tanks. So we had a very aggressive outreach policy to kind of the academic world and the think tank community, and to cultivate relationships that, again, You had smart people talking about the value of the Kurds. I could sit for hours and tell you about why it's imperative for the US to support the Kurds. But one scholar to come out and put an article out in the op-ed, or to make a statement or write a report, did 10 times the work that I could do. So to create this like echo chamber, and to create this kind of multiple directions of creating policy, of validating policy, of monitoring policy, was our strategy. And now we were not like the Armenians or the Jews or the Greeks or even the Lebanese to have an organized diaspora. We had a very small diaspora in the US, only 80,000, and they were not affluent. They were not very organized, but we were still able to organize them in certain areas where there were Kurdish constituencies, whether it was in Nashville, Tennessee, where the largest Kurdish community, don't ask me why, the largest Kurdish community in the US is in Nashville. We have in San Diego the same, in Dallas, Texas. So these areas, we would organize the Kurdish community to be another voice. So this created multiple levels of interest within the US system, and it got to the point where if there was a fear of betrayal, another betrayal of the Kurds, it wouldn't just be us coming out and saying, "Hey, we're going to get screwed again." We had enough assets and enough supporters and enough kind of friends of the Kurds within the policy community that could make enough noise that would then, help change policy. I mean this in the best possible way. I worked for 12 years trying to educate Americans on the Kurds, but it took one tweet from Cher, the singer Cher, who said the Kurds are about to get betrayed, and suddenly the whole United States is on fire. Trump is betraying the Kurds. We gotta stop. And if I'd have known that 12 years ago, I would have just tried to get to Cher then and say, "Hey, can you please come out and support?" But this is, there's no other country like the US for how policies can be made or influenced. It's such a unique country where there's so many centers of power that you could use to navigate and to insert a policy or a statement or an opinion, and that, if you're a policy wonk, it's really the pinnacle, and I enjoyed it at the time. And so I think that's how we, other than, again, what I said earlier to I think Obseb's question, where you've got to place yourself and be relevant and be strategic at the same time. You can't just be show. You can't just be diplomacy and just be hot air, because eventually you're going to get found out. If you provide no significant relevance and no value to a country like the US, then sorry, there's powers, there's greater interest, whether it's in Asia or whether it's in other parts of the Middle East. So aside from the strategy and the tools you have to deploy, you've got to have something to sell. You've got to have something that is going to be relevant to Americans, to voters, to policymakers, to lawmakers. And I think, again, we have, as Kurds, in this crazy part of the world, we have something to offer now, and we've become better at packaging what we have to offer, and we've become better at delivering that message. But at the same time, we still have a ways to go to overcome our own shortcomings and to overcome our own kind of default self-destruct mechanisms that we have as Kurds.
Great. Professor Rena, who's my co-teacher in this course, as well as he's an expert on Russia and the Middle East, would like to ask you a question as well.
Hello. Yes, I teach with Makram, and I teach the course Russia in the Middle East. We both have developed this kind of idea for a curricula that first you have to study United States in the Middle East, and then Russia in the Middle East, and then after that you can start to study the concept of soft power in the Middle East, because you have to know the basics first. So Russia doesn't have soft power, right? It operates in a different way. Like Henry Kissinger said, covert operations are not the same as a missionary operation.
Right.
In this year, for me, I have been working on Russia in the Mediterranean and Soviet Union history in the Mediterranean, I think since 2015. In 2021, it has been quite an interesting year in a way that many changes took place all the way from Iraq to Lebanon to Israel. And this year I have been thinking about that. I often just end up saying that, well, many things are true, but in some ways, Russia and Moscow is the one capital that can talk to everybody in the Middle East, right? It's maybe not a very strong player. It doesn't have a strong doctrine. It's not soft power. It's not so desirable, but it does have it can talk to all the relevant actors in the area. And from that thesis that I have been thinking about this year, I wanted to ask you, how is your relationship with Moscow, and how do you perceive the kind of regional politics of Russia in your part of the Middle East, or in your area, let's put it that way?
Sure. Thank you for the question. It's fascinating. I agree with you. Russia can talk to everyone in the area. Whether it does or not, that's another thing. But they certainly, I think that they don't carry the baggage of the Arab-Israeli process in a way that other countries do. So they're not seen as close to one or the other, or So I think that just makes them less of a polarizing entity in the Middle East. But historically, they've also, especially as it relates to Iraq, Russia, whether before in the Soviet days or in the post-Soviet days, has always had a good relationship with Iraq. Now, that hasn't always translated into a good relationship within the subcomponents of Iraq. They've been much more traditionalist when it comes to dealing with Iraq, and I think in the last 6 years that has changed somewhat, because Russia has much greater economic interests in Kurdistan today as compared to 6-7 years ago. So I think in 2015 they entered Kurdistan's oil market in a big way. They were involved before with some medium-sized companies, but then in 2015 Rosneft came in, invested heavily in the Kurdish pipeline, invested heavily in certain Kurdish oil fields, and it completely changed the nature of Russian engagement with Iraq and with Kurdistan specifically. So they are, to date, again, not very politically involved. They don't get into the nitty-gritty of federalism and the authorities of the region versus the federal. They look at they're completely ignoring that debate. It's a much heavier debate within the US policy community, the Iraqi constitution, the powers of Kurdistan vis-a-vis the powers of the federal government. I think in Moscow, nobody really cares too much about that, but they do care about the investment in Kurdistan and the economic potential of Kurdistan and the natural gas potential of Kurdistan. So I think that, I would say, is the hook right now, and they've done it in a very strategic way where it hasn't, again, they're Russia. So when they say, I'm going to work in Kurdistan, the Iraqi government can complain and cry and say this is but at the end of the day, they came in and they're working in Kurdistan. There's not a damn thing anyone can do about it. So, and I think that's when you're a power, you can act powerfully. And I think when it came to investing in Kurdistan's oil sector, Russia looked at its interests. They looked at the legality of it. There was enough legal cover for them to do what they've done, and they've come in and invested, and they've been able to withstand the incessant complaining of some in the federal government. So I think that's where it's a good relationship. It's a relatively new or rekindled relationship, but one that is very, I would say, one or two dimensional as it relates to Iraqi Kurdistan. With Syria, it's much more complicated because of Russia's engagement with Syria is more complicated than it is with Iraq, and the kind of the Russian-US clash is greater in Syria than it is in Iraq. So the Kurdish element, historically, they were close to Russia, and then they didn't do what the Russians said Kurds should do, and so the Kurds then became more allied with the US, which then created a bit of backlash from Russia, and so it's the Syrian Kurdish relationship with Russia is more complicated, more multifaceted than the Iraqi Kurdish relationship with the Russia is at the moment.
Thank
Okay,
you.
who wants to ask a question?
I want to ask a question.
تفضل مجد.
Ask him about the causes of the civil war between the Kurds in the 1990s and how the actions and the economic situation went into that.
I'm sorry, your voice just cut out as you were asking the question.
So
Can you ask again, please?
Majd was interested in understanding the quote-unquote civil war between the Kurds and how the economic situation reflects on the tensions between the Kurdish components.
The Kurdish Civil War. So we had this election in '92. We formed the government. We formed the parliament. This wasn't a government that was very, obviously it wasn't the best government we've ever had. A lot of people that were just basically revolutionaries that came in and started having key, ministerial positions. It was a very new experiment. There was a lot of, the oldest profession in that part of the world is smuggling. So there was a lot of smuggling going on between Iraq and Turkey. One party kind of controlled the border, and it created a lot of tension. People were fighting over that, the spoils of that smuggling. Political tensions were still left over because the election results, I would say, in the end, they just said it's 50-50 because they couldn't really agree on who won. So rather than, have a runoff, they just said it's 50-50. We kind of both won. And it was like just, fudging it and putting it together in a way that was not very sustainable. Pressures from external pressures were very big on Kurdistan at the time. Turkey was very worried about what was happening in Kurdistan. Iran was very worried about what was happening in Kurdistan. Syria wasn't particularly happy about what's happening in Kurdistan. The US, again, this was an unintended consequence, so there was no real kind of diplomatic efforts to stop the fighting in the early days. It just kind of was like, the Kurds that they're just going to kill each other, and this experiment is going to fail. Sure enough, we regrettably killed each other for years, but in the end, there was mediation. There was, there was the Washington Peace Accords in '98, and that kind of US brokered peace agreement became the basis of the unification of Kurdistan, and that unification became the basis of what we see today as a unified Kurdistan regional government, with its flaws. And I think there were people at the time in Washington that looked at Kurdistan as a potential reliable partner. Again, regime change wasn't the policy in '96, '97, and '98, but there was a strong Iraqi opposition. There was strong lobby from Congress at the time to support the Iraqi opposition, and there would be no Iraqi opposition without the Kurds. So there was a need for the Kurds to be united, and that's why I think there was a lot of diplomatic efforts on the part of the US government at the time to unite the Kurds to stop the civil war. So I think we've crossed that bridge, and we won't return to it, but it's still left its scars on the society today, 30 plus years later.
Okay, Qubad, I have a question also from Edward, related actually to the struggle of the Turkish Kurds, basically. So why did the Kurds of Iraq, why were you successful in carving out your own autonomous region, whereas other Kurds in the region haven't been successful? And what does it take to achieve what you did?
I think you can't compare the path that Iraqi Kurds have taken to where we are today to other Kurdish parts of Iraq, Iran, Turkey, or even Syria. You know, we had the no-fly zones, for example, for a start. So since 1991, Kurdistan of Iraq was independent of Iraq. You know, the Iraqi government had completely withdrawn from Kurdistan, and so there wasn't a sovereign presence in the Kurdistan region of Iraq since 91. Now that kind of evolved and mutated into the KRG as we know it today. Obviously, Operation Iraqi Freedom, getting rid of Saddam, was instrumental in cementing Kurdistan's autonomy from the rest of the country. That is a big difference to the situation of Kurds in Turkey, which are, you know, have their own set of challenges, their own policy issues, a different US policy towards Turkey, and a different Kurdish component within Turkey as well. Iran is completely different, right? Syria, as a result of the war and the kind of the disintegration of Syria, the cantons in Syria are formed, and the SDF was established, and the Kurdish kind of foothold in kind of self-governance in the Kurdish parts of Syria has evolved as a byproduct of the conflict and of the void of governance in Syria. So it's mutating, and it's constantly evolving and or devolving depending on what happens politically and or militarily in Syria. So each region has its own set of conditions, challenges, opportunities, threats, local components, external components. You know, that's why it's not, you can't look at one model and say, oh, how can we replicate this here or there? It's for us, it was a aligning of the stars that was again a once in a lifetime opportunity that came our way, and we needed to make the right decision. We made the right decision, and we benefited from it. Will that opportunity come in Syria, in Iran, Turkey? Who knows?
Well, based on what you've said, your father was clearly a Kurd, but also he did identify himself with the Arabs. He did speak perfect Arabic. He exemplified how someone could have a mixed cultural heritage. Would this actually help the Kurds more if they follow in the footsteps of Jalal Talabani rather than try to follow the Kurdish ghetto model, more or less?
I think what one of the things my father always advocated for was a strong Kurdistan within Iraq, a Kurdistan whose rights were protected, the language was protected, administratively, geographically, and strategically relevant, but not independent, because he knew that independence, as emotionally valid an argument as it is, practically would result in conflict and loss of support, and a loss of that competitive advantage that we possibly had in the region. So I think he was a strong advocate for a pluralistic, democratic, federal Iraq, and believed strongly in the principles of consensus. And we've seen since his passing that Iraq has lost that voice for trying to reach consensus. And when you're in a country like Iraq, there is no winner of an election. Nobody can impose their authority and their dominance and their majority on the rest of the country. So it requires a degree of kind of consensus and bridge building and diplomacy that Iraq hasn't had for many years. So I think if we saw in Turkey before his arrest, Salahuddin Demirtas, who had emerged as this Turkish politician, never presented himself as a Kurdish politician, even though he's very Kurdish. But he did something new. He came in as a Turkish politician that advocated for the rights of the Kurds and did remarkably well in the elections and broke the threshold that was required to get into the parliament, and was able to attract a lot of Turkish votes for his party, which is a predominantly Kurdish party. Now, obviously, he's in prison now, and we can have the Turkey experts explain to us why he's in prison. But I think he saw an opportunity to solve the Kurdish question in Turkey through a Turkish lens, not through just a purely Kurdish zero-sum game, Kurd versus Turk dynamic. And for one reason or another, he wasn't allowed to fulfill his strategy.
Ghadi, last question to Ghadi, please.
Yeah, hello. I just wanted to ask, in relation to what you were saying earlier about the unity of the Kurds and all of that, I wanted to ask, in relation to the article that we read about the Kurds and the US, in the 70s, the PUK and the KDP, they weren't on the greatest terms, and the article mainly states the KDP as being the main party player in that time, and the PUK secret ties with the Soviet Union and passing information to Saddam about the KDP. So what's your take on that, and why weren't they united? What could have happened if they were united?
Well, I think if we had been united all these years, we'd be independent right now. There'd be no doubt about it. In the mid-90s, when Iraq had completely failed as a state and had lost all international support and international legitimacy, in those years, 94, 95, 96, had the Kurds been united in the way that we were in 2005, 6, and 7, Kurdistan would be independent right now. So that's definitely been the downside of lack of Kurdish unity in those days. Now, I don't know which article you're referring to. I don't think that's particularly accurate. I mean, the PUK was only formed in 1970, 75. So it was when the Kurdish revolution collapsed, the PUK was then formed. And when the PUK was formed, the KDP was not necessarily in the revolution. They all kind of got together again in the early 80s. But throughout history, it's the relationships with Baghdad. One has been good and one has been bad, and then it's switched to others is now good, and the other one has gotten bad. So historically, the rivalries between the two parties has forced both parties to seek relationships with neighboring countries, with internally, sometimes against each other, sometimes for each other. And that's the curse of the Kurds, unfortunately, throughout history, except for those rare occasions where we got it right. Throughout history, we haven't got it right, and which is why we have been, and at times continue to be, our worst enemy. Now, this is as much relevant today as it was in the 80s and 90s. If we go into this government formation process in Baghdad disunited, if we don't have a united front in Baghdad today in 2021, we'll lose our rights. We will lose against the different political forces in the country. We are not the majority. We'll never be the majority. So we'll never be stronger in terms of sheer numbers compared to other blocs and other groups and other factions in the country. But if we're unified, we can. We'll if we're unified, we can do a lot more. We can withstand against all kinds of opposition. We can withstand against all kinds of let's say confrontations, and there isn't a force in the country that can outplay us or outmaneuver us if we're united. So this is a big warning to us in the political leadership in Kurdistan that, you know, we'll always have differences. There'll always be policy disputes. There'll always be a rivalry between the various political parties. But on a national level, we have to find some common ground to be united on. Otherwise, we'll, you know, suffer the consequences that we've suffered throughout history.
Thank you very much, Mr. Qubad Talabani, for this great session. Always a pleasure to chat with you. Hopefully, as we said, next time you will be physically present with us. Lebanon needs enlightened minds such as yourself so we can work together for a better region, a region where the US and different political players understand that we are no different from them in the sense that we all embrace liberal values and we want a country that looks like us. On behalf of myself and the class, I would like to thank you and I wish you a pleasant evening.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you, guys. Good luck, and good luck to Lebanon as well. We're thinking of you always.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.